Those are the top stories of the hour, and we start this bulletin in the US. And the US has laid out a new plan for the demilitarization of Gaza at the UN Security Council. Washington says weapons would be decommissioned through an agreed process backed by an internationally funded buyback and reintegration program under independent international monitoring. The proposal follows an October ceasefire brokered by President Donald Trump. Hamas, however, still controls just under half of Gaza, and further Israeli troop withdrawals are tied to the group giving up its weapons. US Ambassador to the UNSC, Mike Walls, said Hamas must have no role in Gaza's future governance. All tunnels and weapons facilities would be destroyed. He confirmed plans for a temporary international stabilization force to help secure Gaza and enable Israeli withdrawal. Hamas says no detailed disarmament plan has been presented, while Israel says the group still holds tens of thousands of weapons. Joining us now to discuss this is Spencer Critchley, a communication strategist, joining us live from California. Thank you very much for joining us, Spencer. It's always a great pleasure to speak to you here on the program. The Gaza plan, of course, it has been fragile to say the least. However, we have seen the return of the last hostage, and now Israel and the United States' prime aim is to disarm Hamas. Do you see a buyback scheme as an effective way of doing so here? And of course, we have to look at the prospects as well of this international destabilization force, which hasn't been fully established yet. How do you think this might play out, Spencer?
To be confident, unfortunately, because of the players involved, there's a multilateral trust deficit. Obviously, we cannot trust Hamas. They have a fanatical devotion to a cause that leads them to willingly sacrifice and even deliberately sacrifice their own innocent civilians. And they, of course, will just lie constantly and feel that they're righteously justified in doing that, since they're fighting, in their view, the forces of worldwide evil. Then you have the Netanyahu government, which has proven to be untrustworthy, with Netanyahu himself, facing criminal penalties for his own personal corruption, and with it being a very shaky coalition of relatively moderate elements, along with the most extreme right-wing Israeli elements who are tending in the sort of mirror image direction of mirroring Hamas. And then, Donald Trump, who is just notorious as the most prolific liar, at least in American history, and whose every move seems to be conditioned by whatever often corrupt angle he can play for his own personal enrichment. Furthermore, with Donald Trump, his sort of fantasy baseball approach, as we might call it in the United States, towards international relations and towards governing in general. I mean, he announces this plan, which seems to so far consist in Hamas will disarm. And then, a technocratic temporary government will be established to run Gaza. So far, we haven't seen any details about how that would actually happen. And as a final point, I'd say it reminds me of a joke that one often sees in the business world in the United States about somebody's business plan amounting to form company, invent brilliant product, get rich. And that seems to be, at least so far, what we've seen from Donald Trump.
Indeed, Spencer, and this international stabilization force, which is set to come in to temporarily stabilize Gaza, there has been a number of countries which have put their names forward for it. Some which, of course, have been flat out denied by Israel. You have the likes of Turkey and some others. The effectiveness of that, have we ever seen anything like that before, especially in an area like Gaza, where, of course, it is so small, so densely populated, and now, of course, 80% destroyed. Can we compare this plan to anything that we've seen previously in history, and how effective it might be, given Israel's controversial and polarizing place in the world right now?
Well, again, there's just enormous uncertainty here, and this effort to set up a board of peace looks like an effort to essentially just cut the United Nations out of the situation and set up some kind of alternative international organization. The United Nations is certainly far from perfect, but we have no reason to trust that a board of peace set up by Donald Trump on the heels of his, openly exploitive, almost colonialist plans that he's previously announced for Gaza, and which doesn't seem to entertain any meaningful role for moderate Palestinians to be running their own territory, hardly inspires confidence.
And of course, the US have said that Hamas must have no future role in Gaza's governance. Who fills that vacuum?
Again, this is why this problem has been so fiendish for so many decades. I wholeheartedly agree Hamas should have no role in Gaza. Hamas, some people mistake it for a liberation movement. It's a combination of a dictatorship, a criminal gang, and a sadistic death cult that preys on its own people. As I mentioned earlier, is perfectly happy to sacrifice untold Palestinian lives, including the lives of children, and seems to welcome the opportunity to publicize videos of the results. The more gruesome, the better. But just declaring that Hamas must have no role in Gaza politics is, as I say, very different from making that happen. Negotiating with Hamas is likely to be a waste of time, as we have seen, since they don't really even believe in the whole world of negotiations and international agreements. They believe they are involved in a historic, world-defining struggle of good versus evil. So that doesn't seem to make very much sense. Israel has taken another approach, which I think you could analyze in terms of game theory, where they realize that the game that Hamas is playing is to use innocent civilians as human shields by locating Hamas fighters in hospitals and schools and under residential buildings and even in residential buildings. And Netanyahu has decided to stop abiding by the rules of that game, which expects a liberal democracy to try to avoid mass killing and maiming of civilians. And Netanyahu seems to have said, well, we're just not going to observe, we're not going to play the role you want for us, and if you're going to put your civilians in harm's way, it's your fault when they get harmed. I hope the United States never adopts a strategy like that. But that leaves us with, how do you get Hamas out of Gaza without going in there with a massive military force and occupying it or bombing it from the air, or whatever else you might try to do using force, which will inevitably result in terrible civilian casualties.
Spencer, do stay with us as we move over to Iran for our next story.